Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Say More podcast. I am your host, Sarah Ozycz, and I'm really happy to be here today with a fantastic guest, Steve Peacock. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much for having me, Sarah.
So if you're not familiar with Steve, I won't steal his spotlight, but he is truly someone who has such a powerful story, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last couple of months, and really happy to have him on the podcast today to talk about his story of strength and resilience and hope. And so I will turn things over to Steve, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself so the listeners can get to know you a bit.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much for doing this incredibly impactful work. This is so exciting, and as a now 56-year-old, just can't imagine earlier in my life having these forums to share our truths, our stories, our pains in order to help others. Hopefully in a preventative way, but at the very least, get people the care they need when there is harm. And maybe that's where I'll start. My name is Steve Peacock. I live in Boston, originally from upstate New York in Rochester, and was the sixth of seven children, five brothers and one sister. And my story has a lot to it, but with respect to what we're talking about today and breaking the stigma, is the fact that I was abused by a older male neighbor when I was anywhere from 10 to 13. I can talk more about that later. And my journey of healing, which by no means has been a straight line, but certainly has been very rewarding, certainly over the last decade or so, as I've been able to shift from what I think of as a very victim mentality to a survivor mentality.
And I just wanted to, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see, but Steve has a survivor shirt on. I noticed that when you joined today, and I love that you chose to wear that today. I think that's such a powerful message and statement.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit to that because it's not a straightforward survivor. It is broken up, and the reason I chose this was a couple of years ago. Marcus Mumford, the lead of Mumford and Sons, disclosed that he was abused as I think in his 6 to 8 year as a 6 or 8 year old child, and his latest or his previous album was called Self-Titled, and all of the songs were really about his disclosure, his healing journey. I do recommend those who really aren't familiar with the impact of child sexual violence to listen to Cannibal. I do also recommend those, obviously trigger warning, those who have been impacted. It is probably the closest thing that I've heard verbalized that really matches quite a few feelings that I experienced. And I'll also talk a little bit more about later that this is both paying tribute to his very public disclosure, and I'm very thankful for that. But it was also made by one of my brothers, so it has a little extra special feel to it.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that story. I wonder if you could make some merch with those shirts, So I would definitely buy one and support that.
I don't have a direct line to Marcus just yet, but yeah, I'll see what I can do.
All right. So one of the questions that I like to ask all of my guests, because I do believe that representation matters, is, what mental health means to them. And the reason I ask this question is because this podcast is focused on destigmatizing behavioral health. And so I'd love to hear from you what mental health means.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. If I were to distill it, mental health means everything. It is my connection with myself. It is my understanding of myself and the world that I interact with. And kind of point to one of the words you mentioned earlier, which is, a big part of resilience is how how my relationship is with myself and my mental health. So to dig back in, while I was abused and afterwards, I did not tell anybody what was done to me. And I'll pause right there. And I try to be very intentional and correct people, which is probably pretty annoying, but I'll do it anyway. Is talk about what was done to me, because nothing happened to me. This idea of things happening or sexual violence happening, it doesn't. It is a intentional act by one or more humans against another. So when I think about that, I didn't tell anybody for a full decade. So I finished out middle school, went to high school, had a seemingly normal existence, but that's where I'd say my relationship with alcohol really started. And although it did have positive impact both on me socially as well as some euphoric feelings, it was definitely masking a lot of pain and caused a lot of unhealthy behaviors. That continued in college. Again, I entered not having told a soul what was done to me. And then really wasn't until after college. I had met somebody in college, and she's now my wife. We got engaged, and around that time, someone had disclosed to me of interfamily sexual violence. And it was the first time that I felt comfortable sharing with another human what was done to me. And I think it was for the first time that I realized, even though I always knew that what was done to me was not right, I couldn't put words to it. I didn't have the language of child sexual abuse, child sexual violence. I alternatively would look at it as just growing up and these things happen, but certainly recognize that it had an impact on my sexual development and my confidence and things of that nature. But until that time, I really didn't think of it in the sense of the harm that was done to me. So I disclosed to my parents and some of my family members, and it was unsatisfying. They were very unsupportive, and these are generally caring people. My parents were very religious. They both since passed. They were both very positive people. They didn't believe in hurting other people. They were kind of practiced what they preached, but they really didn't have any developed sense of or ways to deal with harm. So it was everything happens for a reason. So there was a little bit of the religious flowing in there. It was, these things happen, you'll get over it. So all sorts of things that, quite frankly, I guess I was a little stronger as a 24-year-old than I would have been a 12-year-old hearing those messages. But in any event, it was very painful. And it was a period of what I characterize as re-traumatization. And thankfully, my fiance had recommended therapy for the first time. So it was really the first time in my life that I had the opportunity to talk to somebody about my feelings, to explore my inner world, not necessarily process completely what was done to me or the abuse, but to at least start developing that relationship with myself. Because as I said earlier, with 7 males in the household and 2 females growing up, we were very typical when it came to not sharing emotions, using humor, making fun of each other, quoting movie lines. So the emotional depth wasn't really present. The support and the what I'll call nurturing or cultivating and understanding feelings wasn't part of the equation. It was more of an attempt, certainly by my mother, to smooth everything over by saying everything was great. Now, I know now that her mother died when she was 9, and that that was very painful for her. And I suspect that that had a lifelong impact on her ability to really connect with herself and her emotions. So, in any event, I also know now that the reaction that I got from my siblings was they did care, they just didn't know how to show it. It wasn't a muscle that we had developed. So I just mistook their what I'll call apathy or even repeating of my mother's mantras that happens for a reason, you'll get over it, it's okay kind of thing. Not even it's okay, but you'll get over it, look over here kind of thing. So that's been a very, very powerful part of my healing journey to reconnect with them and have these conversations as adults. But at the time it was very painful. And in one kind of story that I both hate telling, but feel it's important, which is, again, my parents didn't want to hurt me intentionally, but they did invite the parents of the person who abused me to my brother's wedding without my knowledge. That also was very painful, and I had a probably 6 to 10 to 12 Jack and Gingers, and I was absolutely, abusing alcohol in that, and really trying to run from that pain, because I didn't necessarily understand it at that point as pain. I just kind of, almost like my parents turned it around and then went the other direction in terms of everything's great, making people laugh, getting joy from that. Along the way, I had done other individual therapy, and actually I should pause to say that even before the therapist who I eventually met with for a few years in my 20s, the first therapist I went to was through an HMO, and I went into the session. I didn't have any frame of reference. This was it was like dropping me on Mars. And I went down on Milk Street. As a matter of fact, I was there yesterday down in Boston, and look back at it's now an Atrius Health building. So I went in, pretty sterile building, went in, and my recollection is that I wasn't really forthcoming, and the therapist or provider said something to the effect of, maybe you should come back when you're ready to talk. And looking back on it, I don't know if that's what happened. That was my experience. But I think it's an important thing to point out that therapy is not it's not like you're buying a pair of pants and it's going to fit right away. If it does, great. If it doesn't, try more pants.
Yeah.
So that was a negative interaction. Also happened to be a man. So up until recently, most of the therapists I've had have been women and have been very helpful, including a longtime therapist that I worked with for about a dozen years, both in an individual capacity and in group. And both of those were really, really helpful. Not at first. I fought it for years. I was still performing in therapy for, that's how deep some of these protective measures are. But I was able to make some great progress. So, when I think of that part, the therapy part of mental health, it was really almost like, the book you'd want to have when you are born. What you need to know as a human. And, certainly I wish my parents had that, but they didn't. And there's some version of they did the best they could, and some version of they just did what they were showed, and how they developed to deal with the world. So therapy has been a critical part of my mental health. And then on the other side of that, as I alluded to earlier, just doing a lot of things that were damaging to my mental health, like abusing alcohol and doing things that would push people further away than bring them closer.
Well, first, I want to thank you for sharing your story here today. It's again, the word that comes to mind is just incredibly powerful, and your story needs to be heard by everyone. Truly, this is how we heal. Like, this is how we heal. You touched upon so many points. I'm reflecting because there's so many parts that I could talk about here. I think where I'd like to back up a little bit and ask you
Sure.
about is your decision to disclose what was done to you. You know, how did that come about for you? How did you decide, or how did you know or feel in that moment that that was the right time? I'd love to explore that a little bit if you're comfortable.
Yeah, and I'll talk about it in two distinct time frames. One is that initial disclosure that I referenced earlier, which was simply a reaction. I mean, it was obviously in me, and I wanted to bring it out and never saw the opportunity. It was very few days would go by where it was not on my mind at some point. So for me, I think it was that protective wall almost immediately disappeared when the person shared with me. And I felt a connection, and I felt solidarity, and I felt safe. And I don't remember much beyond that then, because it wasn't long after where, as I said, I then disclosed to my parents and a couple of other people, and it was the opposite. It was as if to use the popular term back down there in the 80s, the Iron Curtain fell. And I don't know. Some things I have a very good memory about. Some things I don't. A lot of things related to the painful topics, I don't. And there's a lot of things that weren't painful that I don't remember, which is one of the side effects. And I think about it from time to time, just as in not a nostalgic way, but just sad. It's very sad to live so much life, and then have so much not available for recall, even the good stuff. So not I don't know if there's more that I can say there other than what I have seen now as a pretty visible and often disclosure, is that people will tell me for the first time. So I know that there is a huge unlock when someone sees themselves or their experience in someone else. And I'll contrast that, or maybe reinforce that with the reason I'm here today, is that in November of 2021, so on the eve of my 51st birthday, which many people may or may not be aware that the average age of child sexual abuse is 52. So I kind of look at it those two stages. Yes, I started to disclose when I was 24, but then stopped. And it certainly wasn't public. And it wasn't until I had been on LinkedIn searching for somebody at one of the companies I was looking to do business with. And I came across somebody who was there for a hot minute, but just that moment of time was enough for me and the algorithm and the universe to collide and present him to me, even though that isn't who I was looking for. And that's Alex Proud. And Alex is the father of a sexual assault survivor who was assaulted her freshman year in high school at a private school in New Hampshire. And the story was, I didn't know at the time, but it's a national story, which I'm happy to talk more about as well. But in any event, Alex and his daughter Jessie and wife Susan and family had started a nonprofit I have the right to, dedicated to basically eradicating sexual violence through education. And what he had on his LinkedIn profile, and this still to this day blows me away, because I'm in the financial services industry. He was in the financial services industry, and it was Alex Prout, sexual assault survivor advocate. Like, I wasn't even looking for him, saw those words, I stopped. Something in me just ignited. And I reached out to Alex, and he was back to me within a matter of hours. And I didn't say, well, let me tell you what I did say. I just said, thank you. This is very brave of you and very admirable for you to do this. And your daughter is an absolute hero in my mind for, at 15 years old, basically taking on a 100-year-old institution and incredibly well-heeled lawyers, and really taking it to the national stage and showing that sexual violence is real, it is painful, and it is as hard as it is to disclose. I can only imagine what it is to disclose and then go through the process and to be in a courtroom, which I never have been, or to be in the public setting, or to be on national TV. So I totally am in awe of what Jessie and her family have done. But in terms of me, when I talked to Alex, again, I just said thank you. He reached out, and we started talking, and it was, again, I was almost like I was back 24 years old, and felt very, very, very comfortable. Like, he knew. I think he knew without me even saying anything. And then I did disclose. And, honestly, just like the 4 words that stopped me in my tracks that set me upon this journey that I'm on now, sexual assault survivor advocate, what he said were pretty powerful, but it was pretty succinct. You're not alone. No one had ever said that to me. It's not your fault. No one had ever said that to me. And there are people who care and can help you heal.
And so it sounds like that was a pretty powerful moment for you in your healing journey as well. One of the points that I wanted to just touch on that you've mentioned throughout your time today is this feeling of disclosing only when you felt safe enough to do so. And I think for many reasons, people in similar situations either don't have supports, they don't feel that they will be believed. Sometimes they wonder if they even made it up or if it's real. And so even having one person, as you said, to be an example or to feel safe enough with to disclose the information is life-saving in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly life-altering. I 100%, like, there was night and day in terms of my emotional stability, regulation, relationships with others, connection with myself and others between November 4th, 2021 and November 5th, 2021. It literally was a light switch. Literally was a light switch. And I went from not talking about it for 30 years to it being a pretty prevalent conversation in all forums. I've talked about it at work. I've talked about it on radio shows. I've been on some TV programs. I've been on podcasts. I've advocated for various legislation on consent and the ages of consent in both the federal context and the state context. And to me, I used to think, why did this happen to me? Or I wish it didn't happen to me. And a version of what did happen to me, to your point about, am I making it up? I never thought I was, but I was never clear. I was focused on, well, how old was I? How did this happen? Like, I grew up in a fairly small house with 9 people. First time was in my basement. And then, after that, it was either in my house or in his house. And, for people who may think that this can't happen or it can't happen in like plain sight, like I think it's important for them to know it can. Groomers are skilled. They are persistent. They find their moments. They gain trust. That's probably one of the biggest things. They gain trust. This person came into our house and, you know, I think my mother would refer to him as the wind. Like he was just there and then he wasn't there and he was, and it was just part of the family fabric. And nobody would have suspected anything. Nobody. And nor did I. And being in a family of seven, I don't blame myself, which I think historically I have had bouts of that, which is why did I do it? Why did I freely went over to his house? Like would look forward to or think about the next time. Like these aren't things that a child should have to figure out. And certainly a child who had nobody to talk to, who had no prior warning or conversations, the focus in a Catholic house was just don't have sex until you're married. That's the extent of it. So, or some version of which happened a lot again back in the 80s, and I think it does now, is the version of stranger danger. Like the reality that we know is that child sexual abuse, like somewhere around 90% of the children know the person who abused them. This isn't
Yes.
the boogeyman. And I think there are a lot of people who want us to think that it can't happen, or if it does happen, it's by a group or an individual, that it's easy to, in society, to point and say they did it. Well, it's not them, it's us. It's us. This truly is one of those situations. And it's hard for me to say, but it'd be worse for me not to, is that the a big percent of those perpetrators are family members, parents, grandparents, fathers. I should be very specific about gender, not that women don't abuse, they do, but the large majority are men. Teachers, coaches, people who are really skilled at gaining that trust, and once they have it, they abuse that trust. And given that it's somebody that is known to them, I'm not saying it's better or worse, but I'm saying there's implications on trust when it's not, when it's somebody that you're told is a safe person.
So, Steve, you bring up so many points here. And really, what I kind of keep going back to is that we all need to be more educated on childhood sexual violence and the process that in the way that it can happen for so many, I think, is still very misunderstood. And I think it's the reason why I wanted you on this podcast. One of the reasons is because this is the education that I think many people need and don't receive, whether that's in their own family systems or out in the world. To that point, stigma and shame very much continue to exist in our society, particularly around childhood sexual violence. And I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts about how stigma and shame may have played a part in your journey, and what that meant to you to overcome that.
Yeah, and I'll take them slightly separately, and maybe I'll lump self-blame with shame. And like I alluded to earlier, I wasn't accosted in a parking lot or attacked by a stranger at night. So on some level, at least the way I looked at it as a child, was that this was, aspects of it were mutual. And therefore, with the messages I mentioned unintentionally coming from the religious part of it is somehow that I did something wrong. And that's, I think, what started to cake in through that self-blame, the shame. And through that shame, I think it just created this reluctance for me to tell anybody, for me to share, which then got reinforced when I talked and disclosed in my 20s. And you couple that with what still happens today, although maybe it's more, maybe it's less, I don't even know, but the jokes that are told about priests or prison or all these things where, you're taking something that is a violation like not many other, that really takes your soul, where someone really is in possession of you and hurting you. And to have that joked about or laughed about is just, I think it really does create a lot of confusion, or did create a lot of confusion. And I did feel a lot of shame and ashamed to have been a part of that. The stigma, I'd say, is what prevented me from seeing that none of that was true. The stigma was mental health is only for people who have serious, chronic, diagnosable conditions. And even that people have create a lot of stigma around, which again is just baffling that somebody has a physical or emotional issue and it becomes a target of derision is baffling. And I don't want to say that I didn't do it. I did a lot of things in my life and said a lot of things in my life that I regret. So a lot of these learnings have been pretty recent. But the stigma is there's something wrong with you if you have to go to a therapist. Why would you talk about this with a friend? Why would you talk about this in public? That's just not, that's not okay. There's something wrong with it. And what I think would have happened in my 20s if things had been different and my parents were educated around this and they had strong emotional learnings and they understood the harm that was done, that neither the stigma or the shame would have stuck, but that's not what happened. But it is what happened when I connected with Alex. And I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything wrong. I was groomed. I was manipulated. And then I was violated. And that framing is so important, whatever age that these things are done. Like I've come to realize with my work with I Have the Right To, where the majority of the people I talk to, the majority of the survivors that I talk to are women. And whether they were abused as children, which I know many have been, or in Jesse's case, in a targeted, horrific senior conquest, or whether it's people like Jess Michaels and others who were abused in the early 20s by Jeffrey Epstein, or women like Giselle Pellicoat, who was raped in her 60s. Like the commonality around the stigma and the shame and the societal reaction in some cases are very, very similar. And, and I will say one other thing, that two things that is a little different in my case, or in the case with a lot of men, is one, I was abused as a child. I never felt fear of being sexually harassed or sexual retaliation or sexually assaulted as a teenager on up. So that's something I experienced once or over a period of time. and never again in my life. So I've come to appreciate the experience for women being very different in that regard. And the second is, remarkably, nobody didn't believe me. Like, it wasn't people said that didn't happen. It was just didn't matter that it happened.
Which is a little bit different, right? I
It
hear
is.
what you're saying. As a clinician, when I was seeing clients directly, I would say it was almost the opposite, where for most of them, they were not believed,
Mhm.
and that was across men and women in terms of who I was kind of seeing and working with. So that's a very interesting part of your story, where in fact people did believe you, but as you said, the interest level, wasn't quite what you had hoped for.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I do want to point out the hopeful side of this. And the hopeful side of this is when I had that conversation with Alex and the stigma lifted and the shame and self blame lifted, literally almost overnight. It has opened up a whole new life for me. I am able to trust myself more. I can explore my emotions. I can have deeper connections and relationships with others. I have been able to re engage with my family. I was so mad at them, so mad, so disappointed. And to come to find out that they just didn't have the vocabulary. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. And for me, I just lived decades with the pain of thinking they didn't care. And knowing that that wasn't true has allowed me to reestablish those relationships. It really wasn't going to happen with my parents. I think that they were pretty well set in what we joke about is my last name is Peacock, but it might as well have been Ostrich. Like that was the MO. That was the MO. And I think if they truly knew the impact it had on me and they truly knew the alternatives, they would have made different decisions. But they didn't. They didn't. And that was very painful for me to experience. And when my dad passed, I was still very angry. But my mother passed several years later, and I had done some of this work. So that was another benefit of this work is being able to say goodbye to her in a way that where I was drunk at my dad's funeral. Here I was very present. I was able to forgive her and say goodbye, not out of anger, but just out of compassion.
And so it's very clear to me that you have done some pretty significant and meaningful work for yourself to be able to come on here and talk about this in a way that really tells your story how you want it to be told, and without stigma and shame, which is just beautiful to see. You talked about now speaking on your experience more
Yeah.
publicly. What's been the most rewarding part about publicly speaking around your story?
Yeah. Short answer again, everything. The first time I publicly disclosed was at my workplace. We did a webinar on Global Mental Health Day, and we established what's now an annual event. And myself and a couple of colleagues shared stories. I was talking about sexual abuse. One of my colleagues was talking about the challenges during COVID and a near-death experience of a loved one. And the third person talked about the struggle with lifelong anxiety. And just being able to, scariest thing I've ever done. And I think it was a good thing that it was COVID and I was in this setting and I was in front of a monitor and not 500 people. But the moment I started talking, and what the gist of the talk was that as much as we think we know others, we don't know everything. And oftentimes there's things hiding underneath. And I felt that burden, that stigma of not sharing kind of weighed me down over the years, and alcohol and being goofy and doing unexpected things, all honestly, I think it made me feel powerful, but they didn't heal the core wound. So sharing that, and almost immediately my phone was blowing up, my DMs were blowing up, emails were coming in from people that I was close with, people that I had never met, people that I would never would have suspected would have engaged in the topic, and people who disclosed, and people who talked about things that were not related to sexual assault, like the challenges of not being able to see loved ones during COVID, really opened up the floodgates. And that felt incredibly, incredibly rewarding. And then two other things real quick. I also then went on to talk to my high school, so about 1,000 boys, which was also extremely scary in the gym that I had been in 30 years ago, carrying this pain in silence. To be able to share it there was magical. And everybody was wrapped in attention. It ended with a standing ovation. I could feel the energy. I could feel the empathy, the caring for me, for everyone in the room. We've been back a couple of times since then. I also did the same thing at a corporate conference, about 500 people in the room in that case, and the high school was in the room as well. And then 500 people on the phone, and talked about taking off that mask and dealing with the stigma and just living my life, and encouraging people to do the same. And same type of thing, that same type of electric energy. So the energy that comes from it is very rewarding. And then the disclosures, and then the connections of people just wanting to share, and also wanting to see something different, particularly from a man.
Yeah, I think that's it's one of the reasons why I was so excited that you decided to join my podcast. And I mentioned this in one of my previous episodes too, but we absolutely need not only strong voices and advocacy, but male voices and male advocacy. And I think, that could even be like a part two. Have you back on for part two. I think there's so much there that we could explore. But truly, we need more of you and people like you to set that example for others. And I would love to hear from you too, Steve, if there are any resources that you would like to make others aware of, or that you wish were around for you, that now have made a difference in your recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're tied to sexual abuse, they're tied to masculinity, they're tied to stigma. So two of the books, the one that I read initially after talking to Alex was I Have the Right To by Jessie. She wrote with journalist Jen Abelson. And I never saw myself identifying with a 15-year-old woman. And this violation allowed me to really understand this is something that's done to another human that is dehumanizing. And that experience, that powerlessness and the sense of power dynamics is very similar. That it really made me think differently about what was done to me, and the fact that I wasn't responsible. So I Have the Right To. Chanel Miller's book, Know My Name, was another powerful book. Beyond in both books, they talk a lot about the courtroom dynamics and public hatred and response, which is just, again, this, just like we've seen with the Epstein survivors, this victim blaming and one roadblock after another in the legal system and in the PR world. What I found particularly powerful there is she spends a lot of time talking about her experience of being a woman, and a lot about the catcalling and the harassing and the everyday things that, again, I'm not proud of this. Many of those things I did. So when I think about masculinity, this is my, I have daily revelations. So this was almost yesterday's, which is, we wonder why men act the way they act and think it's some type of aberration, and how could they? The reality is we're acting as we're showed. We are following the social guidelines that have been laid out for us. So, I'd be hard pressed to condemn anyone, particularly because as angry as I do get at sexual violence and other forms of control and power violations. But I know what I was taught, and wasn't explicitly by my parents or necessarily the schools, but it's definitely taught by our culture, and we are acting as, exactly as we're told and we're supposed to. So this is a huge cultural shift. Now, in some cases, that's not true. Obviously, there are individuals who will hurt others for various reasons. Don McPherson was a very key influencer on Alex, as Alex tried to grapple with what was done to Jesse. He wrote a book, the Blind Side of Masculinity. I don't think I'm getting the title right, so we might need to do a quick check on that. But very, very powerful book. And what I'll say there is Don, like a few others in our organization, have come to this work through more, what I'll say, empathy than experience, which is unusual. That's another thing I would certainly advocate for is, it's not the, I have a daughter, I have a wife, I have a mother. It's the other humans are getting hurt. And we're all responsible, and we can all do our part to change the culture. So I'd love to see, we just had a big resolution to a change in legislation here in Massachusetts, where there were two women, among many, who were assaulted by a teacher in Pittsfield, Mass. At Miss Halls. And much like Jesse, these brave, courageous women later in their life spoke up, and both challenged the school. The teacher was fired, but nothing was done to him because it was not against the law, because the age of consent up until this recent passing was 16. And it didn't make exceptions for teachers or those in control. So very, very excited that was debated through the Massachusetts legislature. And I will say, now I think it's something like there were 11 states that didn't have this loophole closed. Now there's 10. It took 10 years to do it here in Massachusetts. Survivor-led. Like, I'd love to see a world where that is not the case. When we see an injustice that's harming other humans, that we all kind of coalesce around it. Same thing we're seeing play out in Washington with the incredibly brave and courageous Epstein survivors. And the other thing I've just noted is, if you go to IHaveTheRightTo.org, plenty of resources beyond that, age appropriate, in terms of starting with kids and, the old, you have to kiss grandpa, or you have to give grandma a hug, those types of things, and appropriate boundary setting, which can start very, very early in life. And then obviously the open communication of feelings and concerns, and allowing that to breathe and live. Those are the things that I didn't have. And I paid a price for it. And I know my parents didn't want that to happen. They just, like I said, didn't really have the tools. And therefore, for most of my life, I have resented them for that.
You shared really wonderful resources, and something I will add too is even just in the fall, I had purchased a book for my own daughter around body consent. And you can start with children as young as 2 and starting to have those conversations. And I recommended it to her school teacher, who did end up, I'm pretty sure, purchasing that book for the class. And I think that we're all, how do I say this? I believe that because we are now speaking up, we are now educated, we are now an advocate, that I'm hopeful that we will get to that point that you described earlier, where we all collectively rally around, we're just not going to hurt other humans, and we're here to protect them. So I'm very hopeful that we will get there.
Yeah, yeah, as mine, as mine. Yeah, so I really do appreciate you doing this work. It's
Yeah.
going to help towards that goal. Is, you know, having us connect with ourselves and then be able to connect with other humans on a deeper level, and then build that empathy. I will say that about group therapy, as much as it was at times the weirdest things I've ever done in my life. It really helped me to better kind of reflect upon the things that I'm saying, that others are saying, how that lands with them, in a way that really helped me kind of build some empathetic muscle that I just never saw before. So I never developed it.
It's a great point. And again, I maybe we'll have you back on for part 2. I think there's so much that we can unpack here. But as kind of one of our wrap up questions, I always like to ask my guests, what would you hope that our listeners walk away with from today's conversation?
I think there's two things. One is just the reality, just know the reality. 1 in 4 women, and anywhere from 1 in 6 to 1 in 13 men, will be the victim of sexual violence before the time they can vote. And it's often by people they know. So when we think of our laws and we think of who we're protecting from and against, when we think of people we're letting into our lives, be aware of that. And this isn't, a doomsday message. It is when we all know better, to paraphrase Maya Angelou, we can do better. And that better will protect our children, and it will protect ourselves. Like this is the type of harm that impacts the entire family unit. In some cases, the neighborhood. In some cases, the community. And it is completely within our control. So the second part of that is exactly where you were going with the books. The resources are out there. They're available. There are organizations like I Have the Right To are dedicated to going into schools. So advocate for your schools to bring in this content, to have these conversations, bring them into your community, bring them into your workplace. Learning doesn't stop when you graduate from your whatever level of education. These life lessons are so critical to us having healthy, productive, loved neighbors, community members, and it will lead to better societies.
Yeah, we're fully aligned on that message, Steve, and so eloquently said. Thank you for sharing that. Um, so at this point, Steve, anything else that you wanted to share today or bring up while I have you on the podcast here?
No, other than I'd love to, one of the very important related aspects is the masculinity, and talking through the socially constructed piece, which I have referred to earlier, and how we move to aspirational masculinity, as Don McPherson and Jackson Katz and others have described it. We've got a lot of men in pain. We've got a lot of women in pain. We've got a lot of women in pain because of men, and it doesn't have to be that way. There's a new playbook that we can introduce so that we can all move together in a healthy way.
So, Steve, I actually may reach out to you to do a part two if you're interested. I think that that would be such a valuable conversation as well. So, stay tuned for that. But, Steve, I want to thank you so very much for joining the podcast today. Um, I feel very moved by your story, and I know that it will have impact for others. And I just want to thank you for being here and being vulnerable and sharing this. This is how we learn. This is how we become educated. And this is how we make change. And we can't expect change without being the change ourselves. And you are that.
Well, I feel like I've been given a gift, and I feel very strongly about trying to give as many others that gift as well.
Well, thank you again so much. For those that are listening, stay tuned for the next episode and hope you stick around for that. And as always, be well. Until next time.